Most of the last half of the book of Genesis is about the story of Joseph. You remember him, right? Colorful coat, sold into slavery by his brothers, rose to be the second most powerful man in Egypt. Joseph was a big deal. He was such a big deal that the beginning of the Exodus story goes like this: "And a new king arose in Egypt who knew not Joseph." It's like a history of the United States saying, a new president was elected and he knew not Hamilton. Joseph's story has been one Jews and Christians have used for centuries as a way of talking about the love and care God has for us. Here was this guy who had tragedy after tragedy come his way, and yet he still managed to end up on top of the heap. At the end of his story, he's responding to his brothers, who are doing a very poor job of apologizing and begging for his forgiveness. They had come from far away to beg for food during a global famine, which Joseph had successfully helped Egypt prepare for. And during everything, they had what must not have been the most comfortable of reunions. And he says to them, "What you meant for evil, God has used for good, so as to keep many people alive." If one isn't careful, we could read something into Joseph's words that aren't there. And it's a similar something that we're hearing a lot right now as people are trying to come to grips with the spread of a global pandemic. This is all a part of God's plan. No, it's not. I'm a Presbyterian, and people have always had a good time poking fun at us for a few reasons, and mostly it's okay. We get ribbed for holding a lot of committee meetings and for being pretty formal, and for the most part, I'm fine with it.
They don't look like Presbyterians to me.
But the one joke people make that really bothers me is the predestination one. And it's not just because they get the doctrine wrong. It's that they're using the wrong words for the idea they're wanting to poke fun at. It's because what they say we believe is bad theology, and bad theology gets people hurt. Bad theology gets people killed. Let's clear something up. Predestination doesn't have much of anything to do with the course of human events. Simply put, predestination is the belief that God chose to save us before we were born. We don't have to earn it or even ask for it. It's about our eternal salvation, and that choice is up to God. So that's not what we're talking about here. Let's set that aside. When people poke fun at us, what is happening is they are confusing the theological idea of God's providence with a philosophical idea called predeterminism. Hang with me, I promise it's not as confusing or boring as you might think. Predeterminism is shorthand for the big, age-old question of whether or not humans have free will. Are we in control of our lives? Do our choices matter? Countless books have been written on the subject, and movies and TV shows have mined this philosophical idea for generations. Some people are very opposed to the idea that our choices aren't important, and it doesn't matter to them whether the predetermined plan is the result of a complex series of logical causes and events or the result of a divine decree. To say we're just puppets is insulting, and I don't blame them. I work hard to be a good person myself and to make good choices, and so I too like to think that my behavior has a direct effect on whether or not things are going well for me. And I think it's that impulse, the I'm really doing the best I can and frankly I'm doing pretty good mentality. It's that impulse that contributes to our response in times of tragedy and hardship, in these times when we've not done anything to warrant illness, death, or other hardships, when we've played our cards right and followed the rules, and what we consider to be bad things still happen. Well, there's got to be a hidden meaning or purpose that we don't see, right? When we talk about God's providence, we're talking about God being the boss. And most of us don't think God wants anything for us other than our good. So if this bad thing is happening, it must be a part of God's plan. Human beings are meaning-making creatures, so this response shouldn't surprise us at all. When we're confronted with situations that are new or unfamiliar, our tendency is to assume that there's a logical explanation for what's going on. Even if we don't know what that explanation is, we assume that there is one. And for Christians, when it comes to matters of great importance, especially situations of life and death, that means we presume God knows what's up, that God's in control, that God has a plan for what's going on. We might even justify this thinking by referring to pieces of evidence as proof. You've heard it these days. Dolphins are returning. Air pollution seems almost non-existent anymore. Murders are way down. Maybe this virus is all a part of God's plan to help the earth reset itself. Could this be like the Great Flood in Genesis, a divine reboot of all creation? Again, no, it's not. Joseph had undeniably been subject to much tragedy and hardship. In addition to the horrors he faced as a result of being sold off by his brothers, he had also basically grown up without his mother, remember? If there was anyone who would want everything to be a part of a plan, it would have been him. And even though he now occupied a perch as one of the most powerful people in the known world, I bet you dollars to donuts he would have traded everything to have gone back and simply lived a normal life in the hills of Canaan with his mom and dad. So when he says to his brothers, "You meant it for evil, but God used it for good," he's giving us the best summary of God's providence there is. Providence means God is on our side, and evil will never have the last word. Tragedy is never a part of God's plan, but God will use instances of tragedy to make life better. God has always done that. So when people say, this virus is all a part of God's plan, we can say, no, it's not. But we can also say, God will ultimately use what's going on for good.